At an old job, I used to have a sign above my desk that I looked at every day. It simply said, "Try not to be a dick today." I never thought of that as a lesson in ethics, but over time, I've realized that maybe it was. Because ethics isn't some abstract academic idea. It's how we show up, how we make decisions, and what we choose to prioritize, even when no one's watching. In the integration world, we like to think of ourselves as practical people. We install systems, we solve problems, we avoid the prickly stuff. Things like consent, bias, racism, power imbalances. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If we're designing environments that people live in, we're shaping their experience of the world. And we can't do that ethically if we don't stop and ask, whose values are driving this? My name is Paul Skelton, and I'm a journalist, industry advocate, and the host of the Master Integrator podcast. My guest today is Shannon Marsh from EQ Technologies. Shannon used to work in IT as a business analyst, so she understands systems. And she's also the only person I know who speaks fluently about something called value-sensitive design. Now, that's not a buzzword. It's a way of thinking about technology that centers around real human needs. If this sounds heavy, that's because it is. But if we care about the future of our industry, it's a conversation we need to have. This is Master Integrator. Here's Shannon Marsh. So you're here to basically talk about a very high level concept that I will admit it's not something that I really ever considered before. And when we first spoke about it, my immediate reaction was, oh, it's going to be one of those discussions. But as we spoke about this idea of ethical technology design, it actually cemented in my mind that this is a really fascinating subject, and it's something that's going to become increasingly important, especially as new technologies emerge and we adopt them as an industry. So I guess let's start at a very high level. When we talk about ethical technology design, because ethics is quite a subjective term, what do you mean?
In 2018, I started my Masters of Business, and my specialisation was in digital transformation. And one of the key elements as I was going through all of my subject matter and all of my studies, and one thing that was emerging significantly for me was ethics plays quite a significant foundational piece in your education. Now, does that mean that we always behave ethically? No. And I think we're seeing that play out in industry, especially in the technology sector. It's not something that we do particularly well. And even though it's covered in education, it's not really covered from a technology perspective. So what I found as I was writing, because every subject required an ethics piece that we had to write into our assessment pieces and our papers. And what became very evident was that we have a myriad of examples of where ethics hasn't been applied or even thought about in terms of technology development. So I actually became very disheartened by this. And as I dug into these concepts a lot more, I found that it wasn't aligning with my value systems. And I had spent almost, 20 years working. At that stage, I'd been working for 16 years in IT implementations and, for various types of softwares and systems and, bespoke systems, etc. And I found that I actually started to think, is this actually an industry I wanted to be a part of? Because it didn't align with my value sets. I mean, we've seen a huge amount of examples of where ethics hasn't been considered in the development in the technology sector. So I actually went through a bit of a crisis of conscience, and I was like, okay, I don't know if I can continue my studies. Like it was that visceral for me. So it was through that process I did quite a lot of soul searching, and luckily I have a good husband who was very encouraging and said, maybe this is exactly the reason why you should finish your studies, because it's such an important part of your voice matters. And it's such an important part of raising this type of awareness. And so I ended up finishing my studies and then had started to really unpack what this all meant from a technology perspective. So when we think about ethical technology design, and I came across a lot of content, started building out a model about what that looks like. the definition that I've given to it is that it that ethical technology design it seeks to balance innovation with functionality while protecting human values. And that ensures that the technology that we're producing is, builds benefits for humanity, society, but most importantly, it avoids things that produces harmful outcomes for all people. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what ethical technology design means.
So you mentioned there that you saw a lot of examples of poor ethical technology design. So what would some of those be, for example? Because a lot of people, I mean, they'd probably look at things and just go with the flow. I guess the other side too is a lot of people who work in technology aren't you. You're not necessarily the stereotypical IT person, what society thinks of when they think of an IT worker.
Yeah.
So it's probably things I've never considered. So what exactly did kind of come up on your radar to raise those red flags?
I'll give a more recent example. I mean, there were lots of examples where we wrote papers on the ethical use of technology. For example, the social emotional contagion that was released by Facebook across their feeds and experimental processes that they were undergoing that was exposing people to different types of content. And when you have somebody, for example, if you were one of the people in that range who were being constantly exposed or barraged by negative content, and say, for example, you're a person who has a predisposition to depression, it can create really negative impacts, especially considering the ubiquitous nature of social media. So, I mean, that was one example. If I'm to use something that's more relevant to the home automation and the integration space, was the most recent one was about Clearview AI breaching the Australian privacy principles. So, as a part of your education, you have to have a very deep understanding of legislation, regulatory requirements, etc. Australian privacy principles is one of those. Now, Clearview AI actually went through a process where they scraped over 3 billion images of Australians from their social media, from their website, from websites, etc. And they use those to train their AI facial recognition software. Now, people would go, well, you put your face out there on social media. What do you expect? But the thing really here is about informed consent. And the Australian Commissioner's Office actually served a breach notice to them, and they've been pursuing them to make sure that they remove those images. Now, when we think about the types of information isn't just about physical data that sits on a row. It is also covers things like biometrics, etc. So we have a right to own our information, including our biometrics. So that would be, our fingerprints, our face, all of those things. And that technology hasn't been overly successful. And I'm sure that it's improving in terms of what it's delivering, but it hasn't been known to be a fairly solid type of technology. Actually, I've got a book sitting right here before me. It says Your Face Belongs to Us by Kashmir Hill. And he was actually involved in the development and the progress of the Clearview AI platform. So he goes into that quite significantly. It's actually, it covers off a range of ethical issues that were considered through that process. So the development of that software. So privacy is a big thing. If we think about the key principles of ethical technology design, it covers sort of 6 basic principles, which are around things like privacy, fairness, transparency, accountability, inclusivity, and sustainability. So when we're thinking about privacy, we need to be thinking about how do we safeguard user data, and how do we ensure transparent data collection and use practices. So that's a big element. And when we think about things like value-sensitive design, one of the things that they look at is, how are we identifying our stakeholders and what their value systems are? So, for example, if we think about the use of biometric data and having informed consent from end users. That leans into this whole notion around transparency. So transparency is making it clear and understandable to users how that technology is going to be used and how your information is going to be used. So that's a very good example if we think about the use of cameras now in an integration environment, because we live in a hyper-connected world. We live in a very hyper-connected world where we have a lot of devices within our environments that are connected now. And when we think about connected, it's not just within our own ecosystem, right? This information is being pushed out. Data that's being collected about you is being pushed out to other environments, and that information is stored away from your inner circle, like your own environment. So understanding and having transparency around that is a really important ethical construct that we need to be considering, and how that data is being used. And is that data being sold off? Like, we don't know. So we need to understand what those partnerships are and those arrangements are with third parties. Because I don't know about you, but if I sign up to, for example, to go to an AI conference, which I did last year, and they make it very clear when you sign up, if you're signing up for this and you are registering, we want you to know that your information is going to be shared with our partners. And you have to make a choice then. Oh, okay, is this something I really want to be involved in, or is this something that I really want to be doing? So, having that kind of transparency then allows the end user to make a choice about what technology they engage with, how they engage with it, and what technology they're using within their ecosystems. Now, we have smartphones, smartwatches, we have all of these types of devices which are now collecting all of this information about us. And I don't know that people really are fully aware. I think that awareness is coming out a lot more about how that information is being used, and the fact that you're being tracked and monitored and all of those sort of things. So when we think about value sensitive design, going back to my original thinking about this, was what does that mean in terms of value tensions? So value tensions are where we have a series of values that we want to follow as a human being, as a part of our moral or ethical code. And if I think about, say, for example, the use of cameras, what is most important to me as a user? So is it safety? Do I have the cameras because I want to feel safe in my own home? I want to be able to record anything that nefarious that's happening or malicious that's happening outside my home or around my home environment? Or do I value privacy more? And this is where, people will often say, well, both of those things are of value to me. And what happens is it creates a tension, because you can't have safety and privacy at the same time. So what does that look like? And then understanding what your stakeholders believe to be of most value to them can actually help guide some of the principles for technology development. So that's one example of the core principles. Some of the other things that are covered off in some of the key principles of ethical technology design are things like fairness. So things like avoiding biases, discrimination and inequality in the design and the deployment of technologies. So when you look at your use cases for your technologies, are you covering people with disabilities? Are you covering women? Are you covering, like, from a gender perspective, are you covering racial considerations? When I did the presentation last year, one of the things I brought up was about the racist soap dispenser, because it was a dispenser it uses sensor technology, and when a person put their hands underneath there, it would dispense the soap. But what they found is it was quite a discriminatory piece of technology, because it only worked for white people. So it didn't recognize black skin. There was a documentary that was done actually through, I think it was available on Netflix, called The Coded Bias. And it talked about a research student who actually noticed a facial recognition technology didn't actually recognize their face because they were dark skinned. So that is where we start to think about bias that sits across technology. And look, I'm actually in the process of reading a whole range of things at the moment about how we see bias in technology. And when you start to unpack all of that, you're thinking, wow, this is such a much broader consideration, especially across the equality thing around fairness. We talked about transparency, so making people aware of what the technology is, how it's used, and making that understandable for end users. That's a big thing because not everybody is going to be a technology expert. And so we need to be considering what transparency really looks like and understanding that sometimes companies have hidden agendas. So making sure that we're making them accountable to that and accountable for our safety, our privacy, etc., needs to be considered through that process. And then we've got inclusivity. So that covers off people with disability, making it accessible and usable for everybody. So the distribution of that technology is also important. I'll talk about that a little bit later, and then sustainability. So making sure that what we're doing minimizes our environmental impact. I just recently saw a small snippet of a documentary in Georgia where they're building all these massive data centers. And those data centers consume a massive amount of power. So these are meta data centers. And what happened is the people of Georgia were actually not paying a huge amount for electricity. But then what happened is we had these big behemoth data centers that moved into there. And what happened is people saw the cost of their power growing exponentially because these data centers were using so much power. And then what happened is the distribution of the cost of that generation of power is then inequitable because the data centers were actually using and consuming such a significant amount of power, and the cost of that was distributed across all people in Georgia. So that's another ethical implication. And not to mention that when we're creating these massive data centers, because we have to house this information somewhere, when we're creating these massive data centers, it has a huge impact on the environment. I mean, we're clearing, massive acres of land to house these data centers. We've got the distribution or the inequality in the distribution of costs to maintain those things. And we also don't know what the impact that has on the actual ecosystem of the environments that we're destroying in the process of that.
Yeah, so you touched on a few things there that I want to circle back to because
Yep.
you've covered quite a few concepts. But let's go back to biometrics for a moment. So obviously that's everywhere. It's on my computer, it's on my phone, but people use
Yeah.
it for access into their homes. Where does the onus fall in terms of protecting that data?
I think predominantly it's awareness and making people aware about how so this comes back to the transparency component, right? It's about, like, even though we're not the producers of the technology, we are implementing that technology. And if we're implementing that technology without that level of transparency, then there's a level of responsibility on us to make sure that end users or our customers are actually aware about of how that data is being used. A good example is the integration management solution that we use for our home automation space. And they have a voice to text component for commands. So if you're wanting the system to do something for you, you can speak to it and it will execute those functions and give you what it is that you're looking for, right? So very similar to the Alexa technology. But Alexa, what it does is it actually doesn't de-identify the user, right? So you have asked a particular question and it identifies that you're the user and it assigns your identity to that request, right? But what happens is in the process of that, it actually takes your voice print, it takes that away from your ecosystem. It then creates a process managing that and to execute that command. and then it sends that information back on how to actually execute that command. It sends back that information to you. In the process of that, and I won't go deep into the technical components of this because it does get complex. So, even just how data is transferred and how it comes back to you, it has a whole range of safety issues. So, for example, from a cybersecurity perspective, it also, like I said, it identifies you as the user, and that information becomes available to the companies that own the technology. So even having that level of awareness at an integrator level means that you can start to make some discerning decisions about the types of technology that you're using in your ecosystem. Now, we've recently in the integration control panel that we're using in terms of what we use for our home automation systems, have developed a voice to text capability, very similar to the Alexa. But what it does in the pursuit of maintaining privacy of users is it actually de-identifies the data. So there's no connection between your request and you as an end user. So from a privacy perspective, that maintains a good ethical construct in my mind, because the collection of data obviously isn't the key focus here. It's about delivering value, and value that sits well with my personal values around my privacy. Because I do, even though I'm in the technology space and I'm in the home automation space with my husband, those things are important. And I'm sure that for a lot of people, as we start to raise the awareness around this, it becomes important for them as well.
Yeah.
So that's one example around the biometrics.
And obviously that kind of goes hand in hand with this idea of transparency that you've mentioned and informed consent, which is obviously a massive consideration, especially, as you mentioned, working with people with disabilities and other vulnerable populations. So this is one area where I definitely find there's a lack of awareness and a lack of knowledge out there with
Mm.
integrators. So with informed consent, let's start with, what do you mean by informed consent, and what are some of the things that integrators are currently doing that, I guess, breaches informed consent? My immediate reaction is terms and conditions accepting on their behalf, but
Yeah.
what
Uh,
else is out there? What else are they doing?
you stole my thunder, Paul.
That's what I'm here for.
Absolutely. So when we look at the function of informed consent, it means that the end user who's being impacted by that technology is fully aware and understands the use of that technology in their environment. And so if we think about the Facebook emotional contagion scenario that I talked about earlier, not at any point was those 600,000 users made aware, I think it was 600,000 plus users, were made aware that they were actually part of a piece of research, and the reactionary process. And that's how we talk about emotional contagions. There's a reactionary process that occurs there. And so at no point was any of those users made aware that their information was going to be used, or they were going to be subject to that level or type of research. There was a retraction, because obviously when you're engaged in, from an academic perspective, when you're engaged in that type of research, there's a whole range of ethical rules that you have to follow. Informed consent is one of them. Do the people who are part of your research data that you're collecting, are they aware and informed, and do they provide consent? Now, Facebook actually tried to get around this by saying, well, when you sign up with our terms and conditions for the use of our product, you're giving us consent to use your data how we see fit. This leans into a whole lot of space, which I won't go into because it's complex, but around big data and how data is collected, how it's labeled, how it's tagged, how it identifies the user, etc. So informed consent means that the end user knows exactly how that information is going to be used and what purpose it serves. If we think about the example I provided around our integration platform, one of the things that they do as a part of that, and this is actually taken from the Australian privacy principles, it asks a series of questions that you must be aware that this information about your biometrics is going to be stored, for example, for facial recognition. We're not going to identify you as a user, but we're going to use the information that you request. Everything's stored on the controller. So your biometrics and all your details are actually stored on the controller. It doesn't go out to a third party, but it provides a platform for informed consent. So as a user, I know that I'm aware of how they're using it. I'm also informed about what they're using it for. And so I dug into this with our integrator. This is part of the conversation around having conversations with your suppliers. Do you fully understand or the technology that you're using in your environment? And when you start to dig into all of this, you actually come across to your customers as a trusted partner, because you're telling them how the technology works. You're making them aware of where that information goes and how it's used. So that is a really good structure or foundational structure for informed consent.
Yeah, what about in instances then if you had a severely disabled client who might have a learning difficulty? I mean, how does an integrator navigate that from an ethical perspective? Because there might not be a way to know that the client actually understands what is in the terms and conditions.
What I would say is, if you are having doubts about the capability of that person to be making those kinds of decisions, then you need to be asking, well, do they have a carer that can understand the use of that technology in their environment? Are there other people that are responsible for making those decisions on behalf of that person, and becoming curious about who your stakeholder is? Because in that particular case, I think we need to be asking those questions about whether or not that person understands. And this is a really grey area, because we may make a whole range of assumptions about what people understand and what they don't. It's like when we just going back to the piece that you said about terms and conditions, and the fact that when we're commissioning all of these pieces of technologies in somebody's environment, we're potentially accepting those terms and conditions on behalf of the people who we're installing the technology for. And is that ethical? And you have to ask yourself, because sometimes you just do it as a part of the process. Well, we have to commission it, so these are the things that we have to do. But do we really understand, even ourselves as integrators, are we curious enough to even understand what those terms and conditions are, and having availability of those terms and conditions to us prior to installation? And in most cases, we don't have that information, when we're commissioning technology in those environments. So it sort of leans into what other types of things that we should be engaging with, especially when we're thinking about like smart TVs, other smart devices that are within our ecosystem, and having those conversations with suppliers. Look, I've been in a situation just recently where a supplier just did not want to listen to the questions I was asking about, actively rolled their eyes at me in a meeting, because I think they were challenged by the question. I don't think people are held accountable. And what I'm saying is that we need to be holding our partners in business accountable for the technology that they're supplying, and be informed about the technology they're supplying and how that information is used, and where those devices are connecting to, if they're connected to the internet, and how those companies, those third parties, how they're using that information. But we often don't look at accountability and transparency around that as a important function of what it is that we do, because we're integrators. You want the technology, we will implement it. But that comes at a cost. And often that cost is it's an unknown cost, right? In terms of the ethical side of it.
And I think there's a potential legal argument there too. I know it's untested, but it,
Mm.
could integrators essentially be liable for any terms and conditions that they agree to on behalf of their client? I think it's an interesting thing to look at. Obviously, it's not going to have an outcome until it is tested in court. But
We want to get to the point where it becomes tested, And then all of a sudden, you've got a mass exodus from the market because people are saying, no, thank you. I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be putting myself in a situation where I could be sued. Or do we get ahead of it and say, let's start having these conversations in industry. Let's make our partners aware that this is something that's important to us because the safety and well-being of our customers are important. And then start seeing ourselves as like the gatekeepers. We essentially are the gatekeepers, right, for technology that we implement within the home environment. So we need to be proactive in having those conversations, yeah, and understanding that demarcation point of responsibility, like who's responsible, where, and when. That's an important conversation we need to be having.
I want to go back to this idea of value tensions, because you mentioned there the idea also of balancing technology with human values. So at the very start of this conversation, I mentioned ethics is subjective. What I think is ethical might be different to what you think is ethical. So how do you navigate a scenario as an integrator where it's a bit murky on what is actually right from an ethical perspective? How do you balance your ethics with your client's ethics to make sure that everyone's actually been, I guess, listened to and agreed with what the ultimate outcome is?
Yeah, look, there's some fundamental baselines here around why ethical technology design is important. There's three key areas. We've got, it helps us determine how technology is in service of and benefit to individuals in the environment. So even understanding that, and society as a whole, even just understanding that, and if you're not sure, have a think about like how that technology is designed, and does it promote a set of values, and does it preclude bias? And to place the human experience and the well-being at the heart of the technology design, right? Those are the reasons why this is important. Now, coming into your question, if you're trying to navigate that as an integrator, there's probably some key questions you need to be asking yourself. And this is a part of the awareness piece, and I'll go into that shortly. But the Australian Ethics Centre has 8 ethical principles that it follows for good technology design. Some of those principles are, because we can doesn't mean we should. So if there's something that you're feeling uncomfortable about because you're starting to develop your ethical mindset, I'm feeling uncomfortable about this. How do I navigate that? Thinking about things like non-instrumental. So we never want to design technology where people are merely a part of the machine, that they are the end beneficiaries of that. If you're seeing some of these capabilities that sit within the use of a particular type of technology, and the end user is not the benefactor of that technology, then you need to be asking yourself, is this an ethical piece of technology that I want to be implementing into the environment? So there's no checklist. It requires us to critically think about the types of technology that we're using and how we're using it and how our partners are using it. So then there's self-determination. Does it maximize the freedom of those affected by the design? And freedom might look very different to different people. And this is where values become a really important part of the identification of that, because what we value and what an end user values might be two totally different things. And this is where stakeholder management is so important in the pursuit of that. Then we've got responsibility. So can we possibly anticipate and design for all possible users? A very interesting thing that came up last year, actually it was Hayley who brought it up from MJD. And she was saying that when they were configuring a system with a pool cover for a pool to automate the actual cover, she had to sit back and think, well, yeah, we can do that. But hang on, what are the implications if somebody can access that pool cover remotely and somebody's in the pool and they can close it? I mean, that is not leveraging the maximum good and minimizing the bad. So that comes into the net benefit concept of the Australian Ethics Centre, their core principles. So from a net benefit perspective, can you anticipate what it is that might possibly happen? And can you maximize the good and minimize the bad? So that is talking about unintended consequences, right? And we're not soothsayers. We can't see the future, but what we can do is critically think about how the configuration of those systems might impact the end users, and does it maximize the good and minimize the bad? And then we have fairness, like treat like cases in a like manner, different cases differently. We have this concept in the implementation of IT systems, which is what we call edge cases, right? And an edge case is something that might occur that's outside the normal pathway of the happy bouncing ball. And we need to be thinking about what those edge cases might be. I actually don't like that term, because I'm thinking technology is designed in a particular way that it executes a very specific function. But what often happens is people find ways to get around it, and get around the way the system is designed to be used in a very particular way. It's like when we see the weaponization of certain technologies, totally unintended. Like, let's think about the use of gunpowder. Traditionally, gunpowder was actually used to develop fireworks. So something really pretty, something people can enjoy. But then we found that we could weaponize it. We created guns, we created bullets. So I'm trying to pre-anticipate the unintended consequences is really important. Does the design of that technology include the most vulnerable user? And this is coming back to some of the things that you were talking about earlier in terms of and understanding, and from a value sensitive design, like understanding who your stakeholder group and who you're designing that technology for. Can that technology be fairly distributed amongst its users, and do it in a way that it considers the most vulnerable in our communities? And then we have purpose. So build and design with honesty, clarity, and fitness for purpose, I think, is the most important thing here. When we think about technology that is designed for a very specific purpose, and are you using it with the purposes in mind? I think if you can start to hash out some of your thinking around that, and being curious and asking yourself that question, I think it helps to navigate tricky ethical scopes, I think, is probably the best word. So it does require some critical thinking. It does require you to sit back and say, I want to be a good person in society. And in order to do that, if I'm delivering technology that doesn't meet those standards, because really ethical technology design is about meeting a set of standards. We're seeing that become quite ubiquitous across globally, in a lot of global conversations around the development of artificial intelligence, for example. But if you can start to sort of navigate some of those complexities, or navigate those concepts for critical thinking, I think that's how you start to build your mindset. So I just want to go back to some of the overarching concepts. If we think about this as like a framework, right? There's sort of 4 key areas for consideration. We have people, process, information, and technology. They are it forms the foundation for ethical technology design. One of the key components around the people part is building ethical awareness, which is what we're doing now, right? We're starting to understand that construct. Building an ethical mindset, which is about how do I apply that critical thinking? So those questions that we talked about just before, those ethical principles, applying those to our thinking, and then applying ethical action. So those are sort of the 3 core foundational pieces of dealing with the people component. Because I think if we each individually think, what is my awareness about this? How do I think about it? And how do I apply it? Once you start breaking those things down, you're already building your ethical mindset. Once you start building your ethical mindset, then you can start applying the action level to it.
Well, so I'm interested here because obviously we've spoken about how to apply that ethical mindset. And we've thought about, taking into consideration a lot of things around value sensitive design, ethical technology design. How, though, does an integrator actually approach this topic with their end user? Because it can be quite a difficult topic to bring up. I guess you don't walk up and say, "So, what are your ethics?"
Yes, right. Yeah, because most people will go, "Oh, where's that going?" But, yeah, look, I think it should form part of your about piece. So when you think about, like, when we have a company, we have a mission statement, we have our value statements, and we need to be incorporating that into our strategic pillars so that when we have a conversation with prospective clients, we can say, this is who we are, this is what we value, and we value that for you. And because most people are probably not doing those things, and I mean, I know myself, we've built that into our core values, and we've built that into our promotional piece about who we are as a company. And we're starting to have that conversation with end users. When I say conversation, we're letting them know who we are, what is important to us, and why it's important. And even when you start to have conversations with your customers, you can say, we value these things because we believe that it's strongly ethical. And in the space of technology, we need to be ethical in terms of the technology that we're delivering and the people that we're engaging with. And so I think this is the awareness piece, right? We have to build our own awareness, but we also have to build the awareness for the people that we're delivering services to. And I think that that forms a big part of the conversational piece that happens around how do we start to build that awareness, build the mindset, and so that end users are aware that we're informed and those things are fundamentally good in terms of the types of technology that we're delivering. And even making them aware, like you said, around the informed consent piece. Those are important conversations to be having with your suppliers so that you can pass on that information to the people you're delivering those services to. So those three things that I spoke about around the awareness, the mindset, and the action are not just what you do as an integrator yourself, but how you communicate that with your customers and your end user groups.
I'm interested to find out how John reacted to this because your husband's been an integrator for quite a while. How did he react when you came to him and said, there's this whole element that we're just not discussing with our clients. We need to be discussing it. How did he get to grips with it and start to implement it into what he was doing?
It's a learning process. So let's think about value sensitive design. It looks at a tripartite methodology. It's all about process, not perfection. And even as we start to, it has caused him to build an ethical mindset. So it is something that he's implementing almost every time he talks to a customer, but not in a way that it sounds academic. So I'm a very academic driven person. I'm also a business analyst. I spent years as a business and systems analyst. So, I have a strong background in that space because it can seem like it's a very academic thing to be talking about. But just even in the process of having those conversations with end users, understanding that the users are aware of things like informed consent, terms and conditions, and building that into his dialogue that he has with customers. I've been having these conversations with my husband for probably 6 years. So it's not something that happens overnight, but I think it's something that you build on and you develop over time. Now, in terms of the work that he does, it has made us sit back and think, well, who are our suppliers? Are those suppliers in alignment with our values as a company? And are they delivering on the same promise that we're delivering on? And as such, we've had to reassess some of the types of products that we're using. So, for example, we're moving to using NDAA approved cameras, which is a national defense approval for the use of cameras, because we know that some companies are not necessarily behaving in the most ethical ways. So we want to have some confidence that the technology that we're implementing, whether it be at a commercial level or whether that be at a residential level, is going to have those ethical principles applied, right? So ethical principles in that space might look like privacy, security, having good cybersecurity in place, understanding how information is used, what platforms they're using. Are they cloud-based? Where are those cloud environments? Where are those cloud environments stored? Are they off-site? So you're leading straight into data sovereignty and making sure that our information that's stored overseas won't have the same legislative compliance that's required as what we might expect here in Australia. So understanding, because now we're moving globally, we're trading globally. We have data centers that in Ireland or in Singapore. So we need to be understanding that level of complexity as well, especially where there's cloud environments associated with some of those devices. So even looking at how your suppliers and how those third parties managing that, you can very clearly start to align some of your own value sets with certain vendors because of those types of reasons. So, yeah, it's been a slow process because it's obviously something that's really important to me. And he understands that and he appreciates that. He knows that for us, from a marketing perspective, is a point of difference. And we know that we can start to have those conversations with our customers, with our suppliers, understanding our supply chain and where that product sits within the supply chain. It might go through a couple of different hands in terms of, who's producing the hardware versus the software that's used to enable the capability for that piece of technology. So yeah, even having those understandings, it's not just plugging in a camera and commissioning it into a network, right? There is so much more that's involved with the use of that technology. So understanding that, even our plug and play devices, Google Nest, Google Home, Alexa, some of those, do we really understand and know how that technology is used? Do our customers know that? Do they understand that? Having those conversations is important because that's how like I said, we build our awareness and mindset.
When you have had those conversations, or those kind of initial conversations with suppliers, when you first started to bring in this ethical mindset within EQ, what was the response? Were they responsive? Were they open to the conversation? Were they largely dismissive? And I guess it's the same when you have spoken to other integrators about it too.
Mhm.
Has the market been, I guess, mature enough to be open to this idea, or are we not there yet?
I don't know that we're there yet. Some have been really responsive and it's been very refreshing and like you, they were like, "Oh, never heard of this ethical technology design stuff." And it starts to plant a seed. Some vendors have been, like I gave the example before of the eye roll, are not as engaged because I don't think they see it as important. But what we're seeing, especially with Australian government at the moment, is, they've started to build out a whole range of ethical principles, especially for the use of artificial intelligence. I think we're going to see we are seeing a significant insurgence, if not it's already there, with the use of AI in some of our home integration componentry. And the Australian government the Department of Industry, Science and Resources have 8 artificial intelligence ethical principles, right? And that looks at creating safer and more reliable and more fairer outcomes for all Australians, reducing risk of negative impact by those affected by AI applications, business and government to practice the highest ethical standards when designing, developing and implementing AI. It goes deeper into those principles at a glance, such as, human social well-being, human-centered values. So that is They should respect the human rights, diversity, and autonomy of individuals. And then it goes into things like privacy and protection and security, reliability and safety, etc. So we're seeing even, like, let's just think about even in Australia, we're seeing that the government is taking this seriously. We're also seeing it with the recent Cybersecurity Act that came out that said, in terms of smart devices, what is it that we need to be doing to make sure that those devices are safe and compliant? And so we're seeing a real push in this area. Might not necessarily come from suppliers, but what they might find themselves in a space of is that, oh, now we're going to have to be producing technology that has all of these ethical principles around it that need to be applied, and safety features like cybersecurity. Cybersecurity leans right into the privacy and the safety of end users significantly, especially with smart devices. So even though some suppliers are not interested, some are. They find it, really interesting. And so we engage in those conversations where we're invited to have those conversations, because not everybody is going to take it up now. But the point I was trying to make is that we're seeing this convergence, or this sort of overlaying requirement at industry and government level, that's going to sort of push pressure down on suppliers to make sure that they're starting to build and develop technology that is a bit more human-centric and a bit more about that values-driven.
Yeah, it's quite funny because I was just sitting here thinking while you were describing, obviously, this emerging role of ethics within our industry. I was thinking back to my days at uni when there were people studying ethics, and we always sat there and thought, well, they're never going to have a job because there's no big ethics factory around the corner they're going to go and, and start at. But this seems like it might be the time for ethicists to find their mojo, I guess, actually put their skills to use.
Yeah, and we're seeing it embedded in so many things at the moment. If I just, obviously the Australian government are quite engaged in this space, which is absolutely fantastic. But in February this year, there was an AI Action Summit that was held in Paris in February. And there was a commitment that was signed by 60 countries around the world, including Australia, big countries like Canada that have quite a strong artificial intelligence network, and China. So there's some of the big players. United States haven't signed it. But, we're talking about 60 first world countries around the world that have engaged in this and see this as an important function. So they want to promote AI accessibility and reduce the digital divides. And how do they do that? So they've got a whole range of commitments that they're wanting to commit to. So things like ensuring AI is open, inclusive, transparent, ethical. They actually use the word ethical, safe, secure, trustworthy, and taking into account international frameworks. One of the biggest complexities in this space is that every country has its own legislation, its own regulatory bodies, etc. How do we build frameworks that are consistent, or ethical frameworks that are consistent and that can be used globally and applied? So some of the other things that they're committing to is the innovation of AI enables conditions that help develop and thrive people within who are using those technologies, encouraging AI deployment that positively shapes the future of our work. There's a lot of rhetoric around there. It's like AI is going to come and take our jobs, but this is really about trying to have a basis that allows us to reshape our working environment. Like, let's think about how we commission a network, right? Within a home integration framework. Is it possible that potentially we can say, well, this is what we need, and the AI can then execute that function, and it leaves you to be thinking about, well, what are the other things that I need to be doing in order to build this integration platform? So, there's lots of possibilities we're not talking about replacing people's jobs, but what we are saying is that we need to have a way in which we can enable the human race to thrive in that environment.
This is such a big subject, in particularly when we start going down the path of AI. So I definitely want to invite you back to look more, especially within the world of ethics and AI. But to wrap up this conversation that we've started today, there's going to be a lot of people listening to this who have never considered ethics. It wouldn't be on their radar. Again, it would be an academic subject that someone says ethics and they say, one of those people.
It's over.
Great. So at a very base level, what's the first step for an integrator from here? If they sit there and think, okay, this is a subject I do need to take seriously, they might have jobs within the disability sector. They might be sitting there thinking, okay, well, I have clients from a completely different background that I'm from. What's the first step? What do they need to do today to start to bring this in?
Listen to this podcast. Right? It's all about building the awareness. I mean, I had this conversation last year when we did the ethical technology design panel. It's all about building your awareness. Building your awareness is, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. It's like you start to build this awareness and curiosity around it. I guess the question you've got to ask yourself is this important to me? Do I want to be seen as a person who's doing the right thing, who's good, or do I not care about that? And look, you get people out there who just don't care. And you know what? That's fine. But most people want to be seen to doing a good job. They want to be identified as good people. And the way in which we can do that is by starting to build our awareness and our mindset about it. There is no rule book for this. We're making the rules as we go, but we're doing it in alignment with good ethical standards. And I think that in itself is a big part of the piece that will lead us on to much better things and allow us to be having those conversations with our suppliers and letting our suppliers know, well, this is actually really important to us. We didn't see the emergence of these ethical standards and principles in government and in international frameworks until people in the tech sector said, we've got some serious ethical issues here. Like, and if we don't pump the brakes, we're going to find ourselves in a place where we can't come back from that. So we have to be thinking about these things like unintended consequences. We have to be thinking about what kind of environments are we engaging in? How are we engaging with our customers about it? Building your awareness around it and then starting to apply a particular mindset is a really, really good start. Having these industry conversations is really, really important because once we start to build a narrative around it, then we can flesh out, well, what does an ethical code of conduct look like for us? What does an ethical impact assessment look like for us? I think when you start to listen to podcasts around ethics and ethical technology design, there's a lot of podcasts out there that are really tapping into this. Become curious and become aware. Like, instead of listening to your true crime podcast or whatever it is you might be, like, make a commitment, one podcast a week to curiously look for, engage with, listen to, and have conversations with other integrators. Because at the end of the day, it's about being a good citizen. It's about being a good citizen.
That was Shannon Marsh from EQ Technologies in Queensland. And if you've made it this far, thank you. Because ethics is not an easy topic. It's personal, it's political, and it's messy. But if we're serious about being professionals, if we want this industry to grow as well as grow up, then this has to be part of the conversation. Technology is never neutral. The systems we design have consequences. And whether we admit it or not, we are responsible for those consequences. Shannon's given us a language for thinking about values and a challenge to be more intentional, to listen more closely, and maybe, just maybe, to try a little harder not to be a dick today. Thanks for listening to Master Integrator. I'm Paul Skelton. I'll see you next time.